Most people were taught that the First Opium War was a clash of civilizations, a cultural misunderstanding between East and West. Or perhaps you were told it was a battle over the noble concept of free trade, opening a closed empire to the modern world. That is the story written in the textbooks, a story of diplomats, emperors, and naval battles. But if you close the history books and open the ledger books of the British East India Company, a very different and much colder story begins to emerge. Behind the smoke of the naval guns and the diplomatic outrage, this was not a war of culture. It was a violent financial restructuring, enforced by the most powerful navy on earth. It was a desperate, bloody campaign to save the British Empire from a catastrophic silver deficit, and to understand why the Royal Navy was transformed into a global debt collection agency, we have to look away from the battlefields and look at a simple, everyday habit that was bankrupting an empire. By the late 18th century, the British public had developed an insatiable addiction to Chinese tea. It wasn't just a luxury for the aristocracy anymore. It was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, consumed by factory workers and lords alike. Millions of pounds of tea leaves were shipped from the port of Canton, all the way to London, every single year. But there was a massive, structural problem hidden inside this trade network. The Qing Emperor in Beijing, ruling over a vast and self-sufficient economy, had no interest in British manufactured goods. They didn't want British wool, they didn't want British clocks, and they certainly didn't want British paper credit. By imperial decree, the Qing Dynasty demanded that all foreign trade be settled in one currency, and one currency only: solid, unadulterated silver. For decades, fleets of British merchant ships arrived in Canton, their holds empty of goods, but heavy with silver bullion. They unloaded the silver, loaded the tea, and sailed back to London. It was a one-way financial hemorrhage. The British Empire, the most powerful economic engine in the world, was slowly bleeding its silver reserves dry. If you look at the balance sheets from the early 1800s, the numbers are terrifying. The trade deficit was not just a commercial problem, it was a threat to national security. Without silver, the Bank of England could not back its currency. Without silver, the government could not fund its military or manage its sovereign debt. The empire was effectively facing a liquidity crisis, driven by a national addiction to a leaf grown halfway across the world. The directors of the East India Company, sitting in their dark, wood-panelled boardrooms in London, realized they were running out of time. They could not simply print more silver, and they could not stop the British public from drinking tea. They needed to find a commodity, something so valuable and so highly addictive that the Chinese would trade their silver back for it. And they found it, not in the factories of England, but in the fertile fields of Bengal, India. Opium. The history books often frame the opium trade as the work of rogue smugglers, a dark underworld operating on the fringes of the empire. But the archival documents tell a much more systemic story. This was not an accident. It was an imperial fiscal policy. The East India Company established a strict monopoly over poppy cultivation in India. They advanced cash to local farmers, forcing them to grow poppies instead of food crops. They built massive processing factories in Patna and Benares, where thousands of workers rolled the raw opium into standardized balls. These balls were packed into wooden chests, stamped with the company's seal, and auctioned off in Calcutta. From there, private merchant syndicates, acting as proxies for the British financial establishment, transported the drugs to the coast of China. This was narco-capitalism on a scale the world had never seen. It was a state-sponsored drug cartel, designed specifically to balance the imperial ledger, and financially, the calculation was a masterpiece of cold, colonial leverage. The opium flowed into China, and the silver, finally, began to flow out. By the 1830s, the trade deficit had been completely reversed. The silver that was once draining the British treasury was now pouring back into London, funding the expansion of the empire. But across the world, on the streets of the Qing Empire, a human catastrophe was unfolding. Millions of Chinese citizens, from imperial bureaucrats to ordinary laborers, became hopelessly addicted. The local economies collapsed, as families sold their land, their businesses, and even their children to buy the drug. The silver drain was now destroying the Qing dynasty's financial stability. Taxes could not be collected, the military was weakened, and the social fabric of the nation was tearing apart. In Beijing, the Daoguang emperor realized that his empire was being hollowed out from the inside. He needed to stop the hemorrhage, not just of health, but of the empire's wealth. In 1839, he appointed a brilliant and incorruptible official named Lin Zexu to solve the crisis. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton with absolute imperial authority. He did not negotiate with the foreign merchants. He demanded the total surrender of their opium stockpiles. When they refused, he blockaded the foreign factories, cutting off their food and water until they capitulated. Over 20,000 chests of British opium were surrendered. Lin Zexu ordered trenches to be dug on the beach at Humen. He mixed the opium with salt and lime and flushed it into the sea. To the Qing emperor, this was a necessary public health measure, a desperate act to save his nation. But to the bankers, the investors, and the politicians in London, this was something entirely different. It was an attack on their collateral. The destroyed opium was valued at over £2 million sterling. More importantly, the entire financial architecture of the British Empire relied on the continuous flow of that drug revenue. If the opium trade stopped, the tea trade stopped, the tax revenues fell, and the imperial credit line would collapse. When the news of the destroyed opium reached London, the reaction was not shame, it was outrage. The financial lobbies pressured the British Parliament to take immediate action. They framed it as a matter of national honour, an insult to the British Crown, a violation of property rights. But beneath the patriotic speeches, the logic was purely mathematical. The empire could not afford to lose its most profitable revenue stream. And so, the Royal Navy, the most sophisticated military machine of the industrial age, was mobilized. They were not sent to defend freedom or spread civilization. They were sent as heavily armed debt collectors, ordered to pry open the Chinese market and demand compensation for the lost drugs. In 1840, the British fleet arrived off the coast of China. It was a devastating display of asymmetric warfare. The British deployed the Nemesis, an iron-hulled, steam-powered gunboat that could navigate shallow rivers, completely immune to the Qing Dynasty's traditional defenses. The Nemesis rained explosive shells onto Chinese coastal forts and destroyed entire fleets of wooden war junks in a matter of hours. Cities were bombarded, ports were blockaded, and the Grand Canal, the vital supply route of the Qing Empire, was cut off. The Qing forces, armed with outdated matchlocks and bows, were slaughtered. The violence was absolute, and its purpose was strictly financial. By 1842, the Qing government, facing total economic and military collapse, was forced to surrender. The two empires met on the deck of a British warship, the HMS Cornwallis, to sign the Treaty of Nanking. If you look at the text of the treaty, it reads less like a peace agreement and more like a foreclosure document. The British did not just demand the reopening of trade. They demanded $21 million silver in war reparations, $6 million for the destroyed opium, $3 million for debts owed by Chinese merchants, and $12 million to cover the cost of the British military expedition. The Qing Empire was forced to pay for the bullets that had killed their own soldiers. Furthermore, the British demanded the opening of 5 treaty ports, where foreign merchants could operate without imperial oversight, and, almost as an afterthought, they demanded the permanent cession of a small, rocky island with a deep-water harbour, Hong Kong, a piece of territory taken not for its natural beauty, but to serve as a secure offshore base for future financial and commercial extraction. The Treaty of Nanking is often called the first of the unequal treaties. It initiated a century of humiliation for China, sparking massive internal rebellions and causing the deaths of tens of millions of people. But if you look at the British ledger books from 1843, the operation was a spectacular success. The silver was flowing back to London. The tea trade was secure. The imperial balance sheet was in the black. The Great Victorian era, an age of unprecedented British wealth and global dominance, was heavily subsidized by this violent narco-capitalism. When we study history, we are usually taught to memorize the names of the admirals, the dates of the battles, and the clauses of the treaties. We are taught to see history as a grand narrative of politics and diplomacy. But if you look closely at the faded paper of the Treaty of Nanking, you don't just see a diplomatic agreement. You see a financial calculation, written in the blood of an empire that refused to buy what it was being sold. You see, the moment a sovereign nation was transformed into a captive market. A geopolitical decision rarely happens in a vacuum. It usually begins as a way to solve a crisis, a budget crisis, a credit crisis, a crisis of a fading empire. And one day, what was just a massive deficit in a ledger book in London becomes a line of warships on the horizon. History remembers the men who signed the treaties, but the true bill, the real cost of those signatures, is always paid by the civilians who were never invited into the room.